Welcome to everyone who is here. Thank you so much for joining us today on this, what are we on? Our Tuesday afternoon, depending on where you are in the world. I am so grateful to be joined by Mark Jefferson and Sarah Bentley Allred. Mark is having some technical issues. I'm going to go ahead and mute him while we start with prayer, so that way he can get, oh, there we go. He's got his act together, so that's good. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and share screen so then that way we can join together and begin our time together with focusing on Jesus. All right. Sorry, my mouse seems to be very sensitive, and so I keep on liking to click through faster than anticipated. Sarah, would you start us off in prayer, please?
Absolutely. Let us pray. Good and loving God, you have blessed us with the responsibility of proclaiming your word to all generations. Give us wisdom and courage to share your message of truth, following the example of our Savior, Jesus Christ. Amen.
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 And go ahead and continue with our scripture.
All right. So our scripture for today is from Psalm 145. One generation shall commend your works to another and shall declare your mighty acts.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. So welcome to our lifelong learning webinar on preaching to the room and intergenerational preaching. I'm so grateful to be joined with my esteemed colleagues in ministry, Sarah Bentley Allred and Mark Jefferson. Before I introduce them, I just want to give a little introduction to Zoom if you're not familiar with it. We are recording this webinar and it will be sent out via email in about 48 hours, and then we'll also include our PowerPoint and other resources that are mentioned. So don't worry, all of this information will come to you. And if you want to, if you have any questions or answers or clarifications, you can mention it in the chat box, which you might need to press the three dots a little more, and you'll the little chat box will appear, much like your old school AOL Instant Messenger, and we will be able to see it from there. And so that's how we'll be doing our questions and answers, and then sort of sharing out any other resources that we think of. All right, so with that, I'm going to go ahead and introduce my colleagues in ministry. The Reverend Mark Jefferson serves as Visiting Assistant Professor of Homiletics at VTS. He earned his bachelor's in political science from Norfolk State University and holds a Master's of Divinity degree from Candler School of Theology at Emory University, and he is currently finishing his PhD in religion at Emory. So welcome, Mark. Thank you so much for agreeing to join us as part of this webinar.
The pleasure's all mine. Thank you for having me.
All right, and Sarah Bentley Allred is a senior Master's of Divinity student. So she is in her third, final, and last semester. It is very exciting. She has worked in children, youth, and family ministry for the last 7 years and is a co-coordinator of the Thursday Night Live, a worship service for all ages at VTS. All right, so with that, we'll go ahead and have Mark start off preaching to many generations in one church.
So thank you for having me. This topic means a great deal to me, one who has the opportunity via our seminary to go near and far preaching the gospel. This topic is particularly interesting to me because seeing concept can work and how it can thrive if it's taken on as a ministry priority. So many moons ago, I was a Christian education director for a large Baptist church in the Atlanta area. And at the time that I was there, we were experiencing tremendous growth. Being 1,000 people join the church every year for like 8 years in a row. And as the Christian education director, my job was to help understand why we were growing and help to kind of facilitate kind of some theological formation in that growth. Pastor of the church and I came to understand was that the church was growing in part because of its appeal to the many generations that came. The church was 130 something years old. And so for people to find new life in a church that has that kind of history means that there has to be intentionality about the outcome. And so understanding that being intentional about addressing different generations that come to a church is critical for a church to be able to thrive as the demographics change. And so the book that we use in church, and the book that I found very helpful, is called One Church, Four Generations, written by Gary McIntosh. And so this book stands out because it really takes seriously the ways in which different generational groups think, function, and act. So yes, there's danger in oversimplifying, but there are some cultural touchstones and some shared imaginations around issues and around imagery and around experience that cause certain generations to congeal around certain beliefs and certain practices. And so McIntosh does a good job of delineating and expressing how each generation provides a unique flavor that a church needs in order for it to be healthy. Now, the downside of the book is that because it was written in 2002, you have a tremendous gap in terms of what has come next, and we'll address that. But for the purposes of anchoring our conversation, at least in the first part, I want to take a look at the four generations that McIntosh speaks about as a way of then thinking about preaching intergenerationally. So our first slide, we deal with the builders. The builder generation are those born prior to 1945. And so this generation, you have what has been considered the greatest generation. In that, you have a group of people that are what they call the GI generation, the pre-25 generation. And you have the silent generation from 25 to 39, and you have the war babies. So when you think about a church, essentially the foundation of a church. They're typically the ones who are going to support the church, typically ones who are going to be invested in the practice of the church. And they're the ones who have been shaped by a series of events and issues that have caused the church to mean a great deal of things to them. So a bit about their profile. This profile of the builders is that they have memories of World War II. They have memories of the Roaring 20s. They have memories of the Great Depression. And they were alive during this broad shift from the ruralization of people in which farming and agriculture were main and they were also part of that shift as people began to crowd into the cities and began to carve out new lives amongst industry and amongst technological advances. So this generation saw the world transition in front of them in many ways. And oftentimes this generation is neglected in churches because of their presence. They're there, they're the ones who keep the church going, they're the ones who help to provide the continuity and memory. But oftentimes, because they provide such needed physical and material and spiritual support to churches, the builders are often neglected, or the builders often hold a lot of power in how churches function, which can also be helpful or harmful depending on the situation. So those are your builders. Those are born before 1945. Next, you have the boomers. The boomers, according to McIntosh, are those born from 1946 to 1964. So those are affectionately called the baby boomers, those who were built after the war, those who were born during the war period and afterwards, and they make up almost a third of our United States population. They also make up a significant portion of our workforce. And so as these boomers begin to retire, as they begin to transition, we find that these boomers continue to impact and shape our churches. And particularly because as boomers begin to transition from active work to retirement, and as many of them begin to get older, the boomer generation is going to put a lot of emphasis upon how churches function in the future. Pastoral care, the ways in which sermons are crafted and created, the ways in which ministries function. This demographic is going to have a large input in terms of what the future of the church becomes, because they're going to end up being the bedrock for how the church transitions. So the boomer profile, they're hard workers, they're typically frugal, they're very patriotic because of the time period in which they came into being. They're typically reserved, emotionally stable, and dependable. Religion functions as a way of expressing their faith, and they're going to be loyal to institutions even if they're declining or dying. So what I found as I've gone out for the seminary preaching 200 sermons for our 200-year anniversary and visiting different experiences, I've been able to see that this is very true, that the boomers really do hold the congregational glue. They are the congregational glue that hold the church together, and they are often loyal even when situations are not going as well as they should. So the boomer generation is, because they make up such a large demographic of who we preach to and who we're reaching and who we're serving, it's very important for us to have a good sense of who they are and what they bring to the table. I want to kind of pause for a second and say that these two groups make up the core of many of our churches. And oftentimes our preaching may or may not attend to the realities of these two groups because we may not have seen them as generational groups, but seeing them in these types of overarching perspectives helps us to begin to think as we plan our sermons and as we begin to think deeply about how we're going to serve these congregants. It gives us ways or helpful, handy approaches to begin to think about these groups of people as we go to the text, as we begin to develop sermons, as we begin to conceive of delivering. That becomes very critical. So after that, here are my folks. So you have the Busters. You have those born between 1965 and 1983, as my birthday is tomorrow. The Busters are those, as you can see by George and Wheezy, those were, we were influenced by the 70s and the early 80s. We are known as Generation X. What in the world happened to the world after our parents were born, right? So Generation X has typically been categorized in many respects. Much has been said about them. Oftentimes, it's the Buster group that is going to help to lead a revival in terms of what the church can and will be. The Boomers group, or the Busters group, the Boomers group, they're typically challengers. They're the ones pushing against all the social norms. They pushed against gender. They pushed against race. They pushed against war. They pushed against all these larger social institutions that seem to be normative they seem to be normative. And so their challenging spirit helped because they're exposed to education. They went through the civil rights movement, and they lived through the energy issues of the 70s. And they've seen and they've experienced in some palpable way the death of public leaders. And because this group of people, in many respects, have had so much happen to them, they've had a way of approaching the world and approaching religion and approaching church that provides a more vibrant and a fresher approach than the generations before, due to the times in which they were born. So the Boomer group brings a lot to the table. Now, the last group that McIntosh talks about is the Bridgers. As the book was published in 2002, but the Bridgers, by way of the Fresh Prince, many of them were functions of the 80s and the 90s and the early 2000s. They grew up with technology. Technology was readily accessible and available. But with the change in American society and American culture, the opportunity for them to achieve the educational advances of their parents and grandparents, and the opportunity to have economic empowerment is going to be totally different in the ways in which that was gained previously. And the pace of the Bridgers world has been sped up exponentially. Now, what's interesting about where we are now is that the book grows silent, and there hasn't really been many works to follow up to really extend this motif further. So what you have is from 2003 to the present, a whole another generation of people who have come into being with the church not necessarily having strategies to engage. So what's interesting about our conversation today is that we must hold the four generations plus this new generation in constant imaginative tension, because all of these generational perspectives are in our congregations. And if our preaching is not attending to these, then our best laid are going to fall flat. So what I'd like to do is provide a couple of perspectives for how we can preach to a mixed generational context. Some of these aren't on the screen, but some of them are. Preaching in a mixed generational context, you must be in relationship, relevant cultural image. It means that as a preacher, you need to be a historian and a cultural anthropologist. There comes a point in which when we preach to people, we have to be able to hold in our mind the ways in which other people think about the world, so that when we go to the scripture for them and with them, we're going with the ability to then extrapolate what the text is saying for us today in the images that are relevant for the people that we serve. And so our job is to be curious culturally, which I'll get to in a minute, is to be curious about what is happening with the images and the touchstones. So if I'm unfamiliar with much about who the boomers are, then it will behoove me to then do research to understand the cultural forces that shape the way in which my congregation thinks about certain things. So my job is to make sure that I am intentional about my desire to want to touch the touchstones that have touched the people that I'm seeking to touch. Read the text with a multi-generational lens. When I preach in churches, I do my best to visualize a congregation. And I may not always have all the information to visualize a congregation beforehand, but what I do is I take these tropes or I take these images of the different generations and I hold them in my imagination. So as I begin to approach the text and as I begin to think about delivery and content and style, I think about that through each generational lens. And by thinking about that through each generational lens, I'm able to hopefully find the right words, the right images, and the right approach that people can walk away saying there was something for me. The whole sermon wasn't geared toward, the millennials. The whole sermon wasn't geared to the Gen Xers. My goal is to be able to create a space in which many people are able to be able to engage in a multi-generational perspective. And that's my job as a preacher, to do that. Illustrate sermons with expansive and specific instances that show generational awareness. Nothing says loving like being able to express ideas and concepts in ways that people understand. So my job is to illustrate. So if I'm going to illustrate my sermon, which means to bring to light something that may be a little clouded by all the rhetoric and all the verbosity of the sermon, my job is to then crystallize that into a way in which people can grasp that. But I must do that in a way that does not turn off people, but actually turns people on, so that someone from a different generation can use it as a teaching point or as a learning point, more so than for me to hope that I'm attending to the things that matter to them. Enlist multi-generational perspectives before, after, and during the sermonic process. This is more of a culture than it is a quick fix. In order to be intentional about preaching in a multi-generational context, it's important for us to include those voices before we preach, to solicit those voices after we preach, but also to preach with those perspectives and voices as we preach. So our job is to enlist those voices and enlist those perspectives so that our preaching has a more well-rounded shape. Some of our preaching is flat on one side and round on another side because we have not necessarily gone through and made the time to enlist the perspectives of the people who we're seeking to preach to. So having people from different generations comment on your sermons and to give you perspective will help you to have a more well-rounded homiletic presentation. And lastly, express generational curiosity as a means to bridge cultural and social divides. As the preacher, you're not the authority who knows, and well, maybe you are, but I'm not. But what's important for me, what's important for great preaching, is that we must be curious. And that curiosity means I don't know everything, and I'm willing to look foolish and ask the foolish question, because my job is to be the bridge between the different generations. So as the preacher, our sermons are to help build bridges between generations and not necessarily build rifts. So it's important for us to think deeply about what that means. So when we think about curiosity, it's a disposition toward the craft and a disposition toward the people that we serve. So I would say to preach well from a multi-generational perspective is to embed in oneself a curiosity about what God is doing in the different phases of time that God has people in front of us.
Wonderful. Thank you, Mark. We're now pausing in between Mark and Sarah, so that way you can ask Mark any questions or any comments for him. We have one question so far from Veronica, and it says, and she asks, how do you get intentional feedback on sermons? I've been getting ad hoc feedback, but generally not specific and not from different groups.
I do it a couple of ways. I have a preaching partner and so I understand the perspective that he brings to the preaching process. And so we talk about the majority of our sermons, and that gives me an angle of perspective. But I also seek out voices that may not necessarily have heard me otherwise. And so I go out the way to find voices that may be different and perspectives that are different than mine to help me think differently about how to approach a text. We're having a workshop in a couple of weeks here for our theaters about how to listen to sermons. And by teaching people how to listen, they're able to give you the type of feedback that you would like. So cultivating a listening circle means, number one, cultivating the spirit of listening in the people who you hope to share with. And so those understandings of listening aren't always clear, and they're not always understood. So listening is something that has to be brokered. What does it mean to listen? How do we listen? What's up? So being able to lay out what it means to listen helps us to then think about what does it mean to preach well to those people who are listening. So I would say go out and find people, stretch you and challenge you, cultivate a spirit of listening with them.
Nice. Any other questions for Mark before we head over to Sarah? Can you give me some examples of a builder perspective? So let me just go ahead, a builder perspective. I'm just going to go ahead and I'm trying to go back and find, oh, here we go. Here's the builder.
When you think about it, when you think about a builder perspective, the church is and was a social religious space. As you see in the succeeding generation, that is not always quite the case. But for the builder's perspective, the church space is a place to see and be seen. It's a place to be engaged with what it means to be human. And it's a place to come in religious practices and dispositions that help people to find a more ground. And so I would say the profile of build, especially for a preacher, is to understand the centrality of church and the centrality of institutions forming them. So church, family, school, those institutions begin to shape in very profound ways the way that generation understands. What I found is that when I preached, the builder generation has definitely been those who have helped me to think critically about my preaching, because they have a very profound history of how things were. And then they're able to juxtapose that with how things are. And because I was not there for how things were, it grounds my preaching in something longer than myself and older than myself, because I can only speak from the perspective that I'll come into the world with. And so for me, the build in terms of how they've been shaped by war, by the ways in which you were taught to keep your emotions to yourself and keep yourself under wraps and to be loyal. Those ways you find that in the church and the ways in which people serve. And so many of the churches that I've been a part of, it wasn't necessarily the boomers and the bridgers who were part of active ministry, but it was really the builders and the group of four. So these two groups really make the core of the church because they're the most dependable group financially and time-wise.
So we have a question from Benjamin. It says, what is your experience with connecting with all generations while preaching out of the pulpit? Sarah, do you think that you'll address that as part of your presentation?
Yeah, if I don't, ask it again. How about that?
Okay. So we're going to go ahead and shift over to Sarah, and hopefully, Benjamin, your question will be answered. So thank you again, Mark, for giving us this grounding and understanding what we're facing when we're preaching to an intergenerational audience of really a span of 80 or 90 years, and having that cultural perspective is so helpful. And so I know you're gonna hang tight when we have questions after Sarah's presentation. And now we're gonna head over to Sarah as she explains how she helped to create our intergenerational worship service here at BTS called Thursday Night Live.
Yeah, so what I have to say about intergenerational preaching is really grounded in my experience over the past few months here at Virginia Theological Seminary. Myself and two other students along with other students and faculty here on campus, have been working to create a service that is really worship for all ages. We call it Thursday Night Live, and it's a service of Holy Eucharist on Thursday evenings. And we are holding a space that is intentionally intergenerational. So we're trying to take into consideration the needs of various ages in worship. So not just children and youth, but they are certainly a part, but the full spectrum of folks on campus who are here with families and without families. And something really unique about this service is we have a different preacher every single week. The service is student-led and coordinated, and we work with both student preachers and faculty preachers. So over the course of this year, I have preached myself, and I've heard about 18 different sermons from different folks, some students, some faculty. So that has been really wonderful. So my reflections really come from watching these different folks preach and reflecting afterwards, and kind of just noticing what seems to work, noticing what seems to engage the most wide age range. So moving on to some of those things that I've noticed about preaching to all ages. One thing I've noticed is that we have intentionally tried to keep our sermon length, asked preachers to preach for about 5 to 7 minutes. Some people really stick to that 5, some people have gone a little bit over, but that generally, the 7-minute range seems to be a good amount of time where somebody is able to say something very meaningful and hold the attention of almost everybody there in the congregation. So we also have seen that stories, images, emotions that are really reaching across generations have worked really well in sermons. So a couple examples that I'll give. Professor Jefferson preached recently, and he used the image of a rope. And that was an image that everybody from a small child to all the way up to older adults, had a very vivid image of what a rope is. And he talked about us being on one side of the rope and Jesus being on the other. We also heard an awesome sermon recently that talked about superheroes. And the children, when this person was preaching, were actually leaning forward and kind of like nudging their parents, and were really engaged in that sermon. And so this preacher talked about superheroes, how they work together. They don't have all of the powers individually, but together they're a really powerful force, and that was kind of like the disciples. They needed to go out together. Some other images were the world's biggest pizza. We had the story of Amazing Grace was told in a sermon, and then we sang that later. So just different stories, images, and emotions that can reach across the generational spectrum. We've had a lot of folks preach without notes. Not everybody, but some people. And I've noticed a certain energy that has come from that, and a certain ability to connect with the different generations in the moment, in the room, and an ability to be more flexible. And so I'll give one example of that. During one sermon, there was a child who was being particularly loud at the moment, and our preacher was about to make a really important point, kind of one of those points that the sermon really hinged on. And she heard this child start crying, and the parent was taking them out. And so she decided she needed to kind of delay making that big point. And so she asked a kid to come up and demonstrate something, and just in the moment had this moment of improv. And after the child had left the sanctuary and it was a little bit quieter again, she went back to her main point and really reinforced that. So having that flexibility has been really crucial in intergenerational preaching. And as Professor Jefferson said before, what I've noticed is in the sermons that work really well for many ages, there's sort of something for everyone. So there's something that a child could understand, a story, an image, a joke, but not everything has to be for everyone. So I've noticed that there can be really deep theology and even scholarship, as long as it sort of is presented along with these other images and stories. So something for everyone, but not everything has to be for everyone. And so I think moving beyond Thursday Night Live at VTS, there's a lot of contexts in which this preaching could work really well. As Professor Jefferson was saying, within any Sunday morning congregation, we really have a range of generations. Even if we have mostly adults, there might be teenagers or people with differing intellectual abilities that are also in the pews that we want to think about. Or maybe you do have a Sunday morning service in which children and youth are present and don't leave for a children's chapel time. But even beyond that, I think about those that are preaching in children's chapel. There are usually adults, maybe parents there, so you might want to think more intergenerationally. Camp contexts, there you might be, your main audience might be the campers, but there would also be counselors and other folks there. Same thing at big youth events. If you're preaching in one of those contexts, there are youth leaders who are there. And so just kind of widening the spectrum and making as much preaching as possible for the whole room, the rooms that's there. So an example of this, I recently visited a church service described as Holy Eucharist, Rite 2 with children's homily. And so the service was very Episcopalian, just kind of by the book. And then at time for the homily, the preacher came down on the steps of up to the chancel and said, bring any little ones who want to come forward can come forward for the homily. And what I realized is I immediately felt like a little bit left out. I don't have children. I was just visiting the church, and I felt a little bit less engaged with the sermon because the preacher was talking specifically to the children. It happened to be a sermon that was really wonderful, and if had been slightly tweaked, could have really spoken to the whole room. And so that has really gotten me thinking about different ways to do that. I think one thing is that preacher was asking a lot of questions, making it very interactive. And they could have asked beyond the circle of children sitting right in front of them. So just looking up at the congregation and saying, does anyone here know blank? Would have kind of brought the whole room into the conversation instead of just focusing on the kids. We had someone do that at Thursday Night Live recently, and I raised my hand when he asked a question, and he immediately called on me, and I was like, oh, I was a little bit surprised, but it brought everybody, all the adults, really into the conversation in a lovely way. So a couple more practical tips that we've seen with Thursday Night Live. Experimenting with the length of the sermon for your context. If you're preaching in children's chapel, it might be a little bit shorter. If it's mostly adults, it might be a little bit longer. We've also asked people to practice with a timer because sometimes you don't know how long you're preaching, and it might, your sense of time might not be the congregation's sense of time. Common everyday images. So some good examples are that we've heard. We're preaching about a quilt and patches on a quilt. It's a familiar image. Sunflowers. We also bad reviews of restaurants was another story image that really spoke to multiple generations. Providing something to look at, which can look a lot of different ways. So there could be props. I recently heard a sermon which there were cups, an empty cup, a half full cup, and a full cup, and different things were poured and emptied. I've also seen preachers that put an image on the cover of the bulletin and refer to that image in their sermon so that people who are really visual have something to look at. At Thursday Night Live, we use actually projectors and have images up on the screen. We have even shown a movie, a little like YouTube clip during a sermon once. And even very young children can relate to that who might not be paying attention to other parts of the service. We had a 2-year-old who pointed out water up on the screen. And we've even had some preachers who, instead of putting an image, just put words up on the screen. So one of our the sermons that our dean here at the seminary preached early on in the fall, he just had discipleship is deeply practical written, those words projected up on the screen. And they really have stuck with me. When I think about his sermon, that's what I think about. So that kind of another mental hook for people. And so a number of people at Thursday Night Live have had a manuscript, but practiced not reading it, but just referring to it. So that might be a practice that you would want to take on. And as Professor Jefferson said, reflecting, asking people what they noticed about your preaching. And I have been visiting different parishes and have seen some different ways that this is being done in parishes. One is having an email sent out to some folks the Sunday in the afternoon, asking what people noticed. And there could be a specific question about preaching. Just saying anything you noticed specifically about my sermon today would be helpful feedback. There's a church in San Francisco that gathers anybody that wants to reflect on the liturgy together for 15 minutes after the service. And sometimes the preaching comes up in those gatherings. And so the bottom line, I think, from Thursday Night Live, in terms of preaching to many ages in one room, has been focus on one takeaway. That usually when you're trying to preach a shorter sermon to a large age span, focusing on one thing allows you to use different images and different stories that engage the wide range of people. And if you try to have too many points, there's kind of not enough time to put in something for everyone. Yeah, so I think that is most of my reflections on Thursday Night Live and what we've noticed. And I hope that answers Benjamin's question about connecting with all generations while preaching. At Thursday Night Live, we've had most people have decided to stand close to the congregation. And so I'm not sure how that has impacted their ability to connect with the congregation, but I have noticed that people tend to stand in the aisle closer to the congregation.
While we're waiting from questions from our wonderful webinar guests, Benjamin said that his question was answered, and he says, I've had a crazy idea lately of using sermon time to do Christian formation, specifically intergenerational. However, I'm envisioning this to be more in the lines of 20 minutes, so using congregation participation. My hope is to give more formation to folks who don't come to Sunday school. Have you any thoughts or advice on this? So this, Sarah, sounds like my idea to do different godly playstations as part of the sermon.
Yeah.
So my idea last year was to do godly play in like different sections of the church or different rooms, and so then that way either the same story or different stories, and then having people reflect in that way. So then that way it's a smaller setting, and so people would feel comfortable giving their thoughts. Mark, have you ever tried something like this?
I have, and I've been a part of conversations like this. One of the major takeaways that I hope those who are leading congregations or part of the leadership of a congregation is that this has to be an ethic. This has to be a disposition of the congregation. This has to be part of the discipleship effort of a church. Being multi-generational or intergenerational is not an option. It is a necessity. And it's a necessity that we must respond to with the utmost seriousness. Jesus has a way of showing us how to do these things, in which in the groups of people who would listen to him, he would have all types of people there.
Mark just screamed from the other room that it's dead. So we're gonna have him come over here to my monitor. We have been interacting in the same. He's been in the next room, so we're gonna go ahead. Look here.
Hold on while I switch the speakers. All right, so you should be good to go.
It's dead, but I'm still alive. So So what I would say is that if you look at Jesus's method of preaching to the parables, hi, I'm Sarah Cipher. Preaching the parables, Jesus took stories that were basic, that were regular, that allow people to see the holy in the everyday experience. And that is how I look at my preaching, and that's how I think about preaching. Preaching is Christian formation at its core. And if we think about that and we take that seriously, then our moment to preach is an extension of ourself as Christian pastor or preacher, as Christian educator. So any way that you can tie in and overlap and ensure that what you're hoping to teach is preached and taught and reinforced and lived in a very practical way will help your congregation exponentially, instead of just taking 10 minutes out, but make that a part of the lifestyle of the church.
Oh, no, don't go away. Mary has a question. Do you have tips about preaching your sermon without a manuscript? Oh, Sarah,
Can I say one thing to on Benjamin's theme? This past Sunday, I went to a church practicing intergenerational worship, and the lectionary had just a snippet of the Joseph story from the Old Testament, and the preacher decided to retell basically the entire Joseph story from beginning to end during the sermon. And so it really was Christian formational. He retold it. It was very engaging. All ages were leaning in to the way that he told it from memory. And at the end, he gave 2 or 3 takeaways to think about that any age person could think about from that story. So I thought that was very formational. I agree that preaching is Christian formation, and I thought that was an interesting way to do it. If you have just a snippet from the lectionary and you want people to have the bigger picture, retelling the story from the pulpit.
And then Mary asked, do you have tips about preaching your sermon without a manuscript? Sarah, have you done this yet? You preach without. Okay. I know. Both of
Elizabeth. So Elizabeth Henry McKeever just put 2 books in the chat.
And I'm going to link them so you can go ahead and answer the question. So not to worry.
Great. So she has helped with Thursday Night Live and done a lot with preaching. I did preach once without notes, and I practiced a lot. I don't know, Professor Jefferson, how do you get to that point?
I mean, for me, and I tell my students, you have to visualize your sermon. It's not about the words you're trying to memorize. It's what am I trying to communicate? And from what I'm trying to communicate, that one simple point, I'm able to then think about the different ways I can bring it to light. So preaching isn't convoluted for me because I try to have one point and then I address it multiple ways. And so I can see it in my mind. I can see what I'm trying to say. And then I can also envision who am I saying it to? And so that helps me to then not worry about, oh my God, I left this sentence out. Because it's not about the sentence. It's about putting together the experience of the text in such a way that is visceral. And so if you don't see it and feel the sermon in that way as you're putting it together, then you're going to need the words to help rejuvenate that feeling. But if it's something that's in you from the very, very, very beginning and it's something you can't wait to share, then it's a different experience than putting it together than trying to line up your paragraphs and your sentences and hope that you don't forget.
And Veronica, along this line, said that she uses a mind map. So rather than an outline, sort of the circles with the spokes coming off of it, where they don't have to be in a certain order, which is always nice and helpful.
And it's about courage. Ultimately, has less to do with technique and more to do with the courage of the preacher. You have to want to connect. And when I preach, I want to connect so badly that I don't want anything to hinder that. And so if something gets in the way of that, I can't do it. So that desire to connect helps me to organize my thoughts in such a way that I can communicate it without looking at what I wrote to be able to do it. Or if I do, it's just a prompt at the very most. Don't be scared. Nobody knows you're doing it, so just do it.
Any other questions for Sarah or for Mark from our attendees? Or do you have questions for each other?
I have a statement and a question.
Okay.
We are all intergenerational. I grew up around older people the majority of my young life. So though I'm young, my experience is multi-generational. My taste in music, my taste in movies, my taste in all these things span generations. And so I don't pigeonhole myself by saying I am of this group, I think in this way, but that becomes a helpful way for me to think about how to engage other generations. But we are intergenerational and multi-generational in our very being. So touching the parts of you that are representative of these different generations helps you to then be in better communication with those that you're seeking. So Sarah, what have you found about Thursday Night Live that prepares students for life in the parish?
I think during life in the parish that sound is always going to be a factor, whether it's somebody's hearing aid like running out of batteries and you can hear the beeping, or somebody coughing, or children. And I think that a lot of our chapel services here at this seminary are very, very quiet. And people like leave the room if they have to like sneeze. And so I think Thursday Night Live prepares folks for a little bit more texture in terms of sound, as well as a little bit more interaction from the congregation. I noticed last week that when the preacher was going for it with his sermon, there was a child who was like raising their hand wanting to say something. And I think the preacher didn't notice. But I wonder like what he was going to say. And the preacher could have, asked him to ask his question. So just a little bit more interaction. I think also the intentionality that we are putting in the preaching right now. Elizabeth Henry McKeever, one of our co-coordinators, meets with preachers before they preach and after they preach at Thursday Night Live. And she just serves as a point of like reflection or support for that person, but helping them notice what the process was like. And so just having that intentional lens, I think would be awesome practice for the parish.
Any other questions? Oh, Sarah, do you have any questions for Mark, or statements and then questions to model what Mark is saying?
Nothing hard because my iPad died, so don't try to be extra crafty, okay?
Not right now, but I know where to find you.
Good.
Wonderful. All right. Any other questions from our attendees before we do a little wrap up?
I have a question for the people in the chat.
Okay.
How are you going to, or what are your strategies, or what are you thinking about implementing as a way of facilitating multi-generational and intergenerational preaching? Because oftentimes we do webinars and we do all these things, we go to conferences, but we are not very clear of the takeaways. And so I would like for people to think critically about, how do I engage this in my preaching? Okay, you may not be the rector of a church, but how can you think about preaching whatever sermons you preach, whenever you preach them, how can you do that and be more intentional? Or if you're the rector of a church, how can you create an atmosphere of intergenerational camaraderie in the preaching moment and beyond? So I'm just curious to see what people are thinking in terms of what am I actually going to do because of what I've heard.
Malia responded saying that she's going to be sending / reading sermon drafts to her 12-year-old.
There we go.
I love it.
I love that. That's
amazing.
So cool. Yeah.
That's good.
That's a really great idea. Oh, she's a tough cookie. Yes.
My grandfather pastored for 47 years, and so I was his homiletic critic, and my typical refrain was, "It's too long." And so whether he listened to me or not, I don't know. But kids have a way about these things, and so we should listen to them.
So Michelle said that...
Meech!
Clearly Mark knows you. That Michelle started an all ages worship on first Sundays in January. And she's using stories with very little commentary, if any. Kelly Mary says, I will use more images and imagination.
There we go.
Benjamin says, I will try to ask questions during my sermon that require an actual response. I love that. I'm always surprised and delighted to have both children and adults respond. I hope to use more multi-generation references / illustrations. Elizabeth says, I'm going to try and be more intentional about preaching to the whole room on Sunday morning, leaning more on images. Bruce says, we have a pretty vibrant youth group program, and I have thick skin, so I'll be asking for conversation about my sermon on occasion.
That's so great.
Lean into it.
What a good resource. Yeah.
I like it. Well, I look forward to going to your churches and seeing how that plays out. We want to follow up.
Right. Michelle says she's wondering how to encourage participation in a congregation that isn't used to reflection. Do you have experience with that? It
may not start in the preaching moment, but it starts in the coffee hour and asking people who would like to take their discipleship deeper. And that conversation of how do I take my discipleship to a deeper place allows people to listen differently for what you're saying. Everybody may not sign up at first. You only get the faithful 3. But if those people are intent on learning how to be disciples, then they're going to engage your sermons differently than if they're going to show up and just receive the words that you have to say. So taking the time that people already gather and making it more meaningful so that when you ask them to do something else, it comes out of the deep meaning that they've cultivated in what they've already done. Instead of asking them to do something else in the beginning, you want to deepen what they're already doing and then be able to extrapolate from that and create an opportunity.
I haven't tried this, so this is just an idea. But what we do with Thursday Night Live is we've had a gathering more on a monthly basis where we invite folks to come and reflect on Thursday Night Live in general. And sometimes we have specific things about preaching and sometimes not. But we give some sticky notes and some time to think about what have you really appreciated about the service, what are your concerns, and what are your hopes and dreams. And that has been a good framework for us. And we let people put up their comments, and then we sort of read those back to the room and have a reflection on that. And perhaps that's even something that could happen at coffee hour. Like you could have big poster and have people write, I appreciated this from the sermon today. These are some things that I wondered or I was thinking about or questions I had from the sermon. These are hopes I have for preaching in our parish.
So Richard said, I will be more mindful of illustrations, how the illustrations will be heard from various generations. Also try to look for more common images that stretch across the generations. That was some good reflective listening. And Stephen said, a question for Mark. You mentioned rapid and significant growth at your church in Atlanta. To what do you attribute this?
I would say it's a mix of some factors that can and can't be replicated. So one is the window of time, and you can't necessarily replicate windows of time. Where your church is located demographically, what is happening business-wise, what's happening politically and socially in your space, all that impinges upon how growth and what growth looks like in your context. So we were in Atlanta in the time in which from 04 until maybe 11, 12, there was this tremendous, I'll say up and through the recession, that there was steady growth. People were steady moving. Opportunities were constantly happening, so that the church was the recipient of that area thriving. So you're gonna invariably catch some growth just by being present, but there has to be an intentionality from the church towards growth. So the pastor came, he was new, and he came and he intentionally cultivated an atmosphere of growth. And he said, look, we are going to grow, and we're going to grow by engaging in a multi-generational, intergenerational model. And he was willing to take the lumps and the successes that come with that, because you're going to have people who want everything for everybody. They want all the hymns about them all the time. They want all the things about them because they pay or they whatever. But in asking the church to think about being disciples means that it's not about what makes me happy all the time, but what serves the greater good of the congregation. And so this hymn may not be the hymn I want, or this may not be the way I'm used to doing things, but if it's going to reach a different group and include them into the worship, then these are conversations that we were willing to make. Those are conversations we're willing to have, and we were willing to have difficult conversations when people raise questions about why didn't their favorite hymn get sung this Sunday. But taking that into consideration and owning that on the front end allowed us to grow, because people bought into the team philosophy of this is not about what I like, it's about what we like. And as people saw growth, they were able to trust that the pastor's vision for that was true. And so it was a mutual thing. You take a chance, people trust you, you have success breeds more trust, and then you handle difficulties because you trust each other. So it's kind of like a cycle, but you have to be willing to do that again.
Michelle says that she'll be practicing stories without a manuscript. You can do it.
Michelle, you can do it. I know you can do it because I know you. I know you can do it.
I say that is a very strong vote of commendation from Mark Jefferson. All right, so with that, thank you all so much for hanging in. We had 21 participants for this entire time. So wonderful. Thank you so much for bringing all of your questions and your stories and your wonderings and just everything. So this was utterly fabulous.
I don't want to cut Sarah Stone-Cypher off because I'm Sarah Stone-Cypher right there. If you have other questions, please email them to Sarah or Lifelong Learning or wherever she says. And we'll do our best to either deal with them now and or make that a subsequent webinar or something of the sort.
And so we have 2 amazing webinars coming up, including Gathering Community Online, where I'm going to be talking with the women behind Her Way of Love and the Hive Apiary, as to how they cultivate a community online, sometimes from absolutely nothing and sometimes from a congregation. And then my friends over at Building Faith will be doing one on inclusive church, talking about older members. And then also members with other different cognitive needs. So that will be wonderful. So that all of this information, including our PowerPoint, including our books that we mentioned, will be coming up in an email sent in about 48 hours-ish. And a huge thank you to our presenters, to Mark and to Sarah, and sharing your knowledge and really love of what you all are doing with us. It was wonderful to hear everything sort of synthesized together, as I've learned from both of you about what you're doing. And so it was wonderful to hear it all come together.
Thank you,
Sarah. Yeah.
Really would have hung up on everybody up here on accident. So the fact that you did this for us is a great gift to me, at least. So,
absolutely. I am happy to help out. And again, thank you all so much for attending. And again, the webinar follow-up email will be in your inboxes in probably about 48 hours. So hang tight. And thank you all again so much for joining with us, and to being such a wonderful, active audience. You all were amazing.
Preach hard.
Yeah.
Preach hard.
He says preach hard.
Preach hard.
Preach hard. All right. So with that, go in peace to love and serve the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
Thanks be to God. Bye.